Welcome to another episode of The Impact of AI, sponsored by AI Time Journal. Each week, we explore how AI and cognitive technologies impact us daily, both personally and professionally. For those of you whom I've not met, my name's Melissa Drew, and I will be your host for this week's episode. This week, we are going to focus on AI and the future of climate. And our special guest today is Stacey Gifford. She is a manager research at IBM. To be transparent, I also do work with IBM, but I didn't come across her because of her role at IBM. I was checking out YouTube and I happened to come across this YouTube of Stacey Gifford, research manager, talking about climate. And more specifically, talking about the long-term shifts of temperatures and weather patterns, and then pulling in how AI can help climate change. And I was totally engrossed for the 11 minutes and 56 seconds that it was recorded. And at the end of it, I immediately reached out to Stacey and said, I've got to interview you. So Stacey, welcome.
Thanks so much. That's a really flattering introduction.
Sure.
I appreciate that a lot.
Our first question is the same. Typically, we have noticed, especially myself, who tends to look at everybody on LinkedIn now, but we tend to find that nowadays, not everybody's career is straight and narrow. There was always a path or a journey to get to where you are today. And what is most notably about your background is you started out with educational background in biochemistry, biophysics, molecular biophysics, biochemistry, a doctorate in molecular biophysics and chemistry. And I think at one point you also were School of Medicine at one point, I see there. So there's got to be a really interesting story about how this chemical, biophysical, medical background turned into, I am now working on AI and the future of climate change.
Yeah, yes. So it is a meandering career path for sure, but it's been a lot of fun. So I started my career in biochemistry, biophysics, like you pointed out. I did my undergraduate at RPI in biochemistry and biophysics. I went straight into graduate school and did my PhD in the exact same field, molecular biochemistry and biophysics. And I was very much in the lab. Like I was a hands-on experimentalist. I was purifying proteins. I was looking at protein-protein interactions, doing cell biology and microscopy and all that good stuff. And I realized probably about halfway through my PhD that I did not want to stay in academia. And so I started to look for opportunities to kind of get more involved in other areas. So I did a lot of teaching. I was an adjunct professor for a little while I was wrapping up some papers and doing a postdoc at Yale. And I happened across a job posting for a postdoctoral role at IBM Research, looking for somebody with pretty much my exact skill set, which I really hadn't expected because I knew, so my husband actually was at IBM Research at the time in a completely different department doing, he's a applied mathematician essentially, but and neither of us were like, why is IBM doing biology? Like, this doesn't make any sense. So anyway, I applied for it. I got the role and it turned out it was basically a great fit for me. So I was working with a team that was doing nanofluidics using IBM semiconductor technology and applying it to the biological space. So they needed somebody who knew something about biochemistry and biology. And I was in that group for about 5 years and it was a great experience. I was hired as a full-time research staff member. And we had a blast. Like we got a lot of publications and it was a great scientific experience, but I was very much isolated in the lab and I kept kind of poking my head out and being like, there's so much else going on at IBM Research in AI and cloud and quantum, and I don't know anything about any of those things and I want to. And I also wanted more experience kind of on the business and organizational side of things. So one of the great things about working for a company like IBM is they have a lot of rotational assignments that give you an opportunity to kind of explore other roles within the company and reinvent yourself a little bit. And so I did one of those for a year called a technical assistant, where I worked with the COO of IBM Research, who was also the VP of what we had at that time called industry research. And that was honestly probably like one of the most pivotal points in my career. It was a fantastic experience. I learned so much about the organization, how research strategy is managed, how to operationalize projects. And it was fantastic experience. And I came into work one day and my boss, Catherine Guarini, who's now CIO of IBM, she was like, I think we should do research in climate. And I was like, yes, we should. Like,
And what year was that?
that was 2019, like the
Got it.
very end of 2019. So I had like the privilege of being part of the team that was able to launch this new research initiative. And this was right before the pandemic hit, but we were very intentional about making a global team. And we did a lot of workshopping, and we just sort of took a really holistic view of what are the strengths of IBM, like what value can we provide to this huge global challenge. And, we came up with 3 areas, one of them being materials discovery, one of them being AI for climate impact, so climate modeling and prediction, and one really looking more at like how we can use cloud computing and make that a more sustainable endeavor. And that was what we launched. Like literally we got sent home from work, and we were in the midst of launching this new research initiative. And because I was involved in that process and I had a chemistry background, I raised my hand to be part of the materials discovery team. And that's really how I transitioned from, what was seemingly a very different field to where I am now. And so full disclosure, I'm on a podcast about AI, but I'm not an AI expert. But I definitely have I've gotten to the point where I have the domain expertise to really understand the value of applying AI in this space. And so our focus is really taking the core AI capabilities of IBM and IBM research and using them to accelerate how we discover new materials for carbon capture today. And so that's kind of the story of how I got from there to here.
Which is a perfect segue into, so what do you do today?
Yeah, so I'm a co-lead for our materials discovery carbon capture research strategy. And I work with a bunch of really great global leaders. We have about 50 researchers in our program. And I work out of Yorktown Heights, but we have folks who are in Brazil, in the UK, Tokyo, and Haifa, and Zurich. And we have folks who are leveraging things like NLP technology to enhance how we're able to ingest research articles out there and help better understand the literature and sort of what the opportunities are in the space. We have researchers who are applying machine learning and generative modeling techniques to produce new molecules that can serve as monomers for membranes for CO2 separation that we can use to create nanoporous materials that we can use to improve or rank existing solvents for CO2 separation. And then we have folks who are simulating CO2 fluid flow and geological storage sites. And then we also have experimentalists. So I still lead an experimental team in Yorktown, and they're creating tools to help create large data sets that we can use to feed back into our AI models. So they're doing rapid testing of solvents and creating data sets that help guide future discovery through these AI models. And then we also have teams that are doing something similar for catalyst discovery. And then we also have some experimental teams doing some pilot testing of nanoporous materials. So it's a really wide range of projects, but they all are very much centered around how can we accelerate discovery of these materials for carbon capture technology that we know is really critical for helping address the climate challenge. So I help manage that strategy. That's kind of part one. And then a lot of that also includes like reaching out to clients and trying to find partners, looking for funding. We apply for government grants. And then, just sort of trying to look for opportunities within IBM where we can better leverage some of the technologies that are being built in like these core AI teams or cloud teams or quantum teams.
So when you talk about the future of climate change and being able to impact that, what you're focused on is reducing, because you mentioned a lot about the materials discovery related to the carbon capture. Okay, so if I'm listening to this, I mean, there's a lot going on from what you've just described. But if I try to explain this and how I think I heard it, it's in order to reduce our carbon footprint, we need to capture some of that CO2 that's in the air.
Maybe it would be helpful for me to just like take a second to explain what carbon capture technology is.
That's a great idea.
Okay, probably should have started there.
No, you're so passionate about this. I didn't want to stop you.
So, right. So if you look at, there's a whole bunch of plans that are out there on sort of like how we can, right. So the fundamental problem is we're looking at like a 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature, over the next several decades. And we want to stop that. And the driving cause of that temperature change is due to increasing greenhouse gases, primarily CO2. So we can reduce how much CO2 we're contributing into the atmosphere by switching to things like renewable energy and making processes more efficient and all that good stuff. And that's a huge, important way of helping address this problem. But most of the plans for getting to our target CO2 emissions still leave a gap. And the main way that we can solve that gap in CO2 emissions is by capturing them at sources of major emissions. So things like power plants, particularly coal-fired power plants, but also natural gas fired power plants. Also, cement plants are a huge emitter of CO2, and steel plants as well. So those are kind of the big ones. And then the other technology that is getting a lot more attention, really even over the past year and a half or so, is direct air capture, which actually removes CO2 directly from the atmosphere. And that's a much harder problem because the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is like 0.4% versus, on the order of 10% at some of these major point source emitters. So that's kind of the problem. And the reason that materials discovery is important in that space is that there are some technologies that exist today for carbon capture, but they're not terribly sophisticated. The ones that are being applied at scale are almost entirely amine-based solvents, which are things like monoethanolamine, which is not like a sophisticated material, but it happens to work pretty well. And it has, some reasonable properties. It's pretty affordable. But these materials also have some pretty significant drawbacks. So when you bind the CO2 to them, you have to regenerate the solvent by heating it up and releasing the CO2 back into a stream where you can then pipe it off and do something else with it, like store it underground. That heat that's required to regenerate it is quite high. And so you actually get a thermal penalty, which is an energy penalty, which is actually a CO2 penalty. So you're
I was
actually
going to say, we don't like that one. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So minimizing that has been a huge focus. They also degrade. So there's thermal and oxidative degradation, and those degradation products can actually get aerosolized, and then you have to remove those on top of removing the CO2. So it adds a lot of operational costs to the process. And then some of those degradation products are also caustic. So they cause all sorts of issues in the plant. And I mean, at the end of the day, it all kind of just boils down to cost of, like, there's CapEx and there's OpEx, right? There's capital expenditure and operating expenditure. And you want to minimize those as much as possible, because as it stands today, we don't have a lot of financial incentives to capture your CO2 other than like doing it out of the goodness of your heart and some minor tax incentives. So if we can bring that cost down, then we can start to drive adoption up and really make this a more viable, scalable technology. And one of the main ways of driving that cost down is by reducing or by improving the materials themselves. So I kind of walked through why we need to go for solvents, but there are similar challenges that are associated with some of these other technologies like nanoporous materials and membranes as well.
Really, what I'm taking away from, I've got a couple takeaways, but one of them is, we hear in the news, we hear on NPR, we had the recent summit, over in Europe, but ultimately all the things that we're doing or say we're doing, or the Paris Accord, all of this is great, but it sounds like it has a much longer lead time before we can start seeing results. So what the other takeaway is, you and the role that you play in what you're doing in your research is that you're trying to find a more quicker way of getting there that has a higher impact. And then the materials research you're doing, combined with your background, trying to reduce the material costs and also looking at the total cost of ownership for what you just said. Yes, we could do it this way, but if you look at the total cost of ownership, it's actually going to, have a negative impact and probably give us more CO2 than if we try to do it a different way.
It'll slow adoption down to a point where we won't hit the targets that we're trying to hit in terms of reduced emissions. So I think,
so do you think this is the fastest way? Because again, the whole point of what you're saying is you and your team are taking a stance that focused on the applied materials science is really the path to go.
So
Correct?
I wouldn't say it's the only path. I mean, I think,
Okay.
like I said, when we kicked off the research strategy, nearly 2 years ago, we were looking at areas where we felt like IBM could contribute
Mm-hmm.
and play to its strengths, right? Because there's a lot of things you can do in the space, right? Like you can go develop new renewable energy technologies or whatever. And, um, you know, but I think for us, like IBM has a pretty strong material science background. And then we also have a very strong background in applying AI to materials discovery. So we're not just doing this for carbon capture materials. We have other programs at IBM that are looking at this for drug discovery and for new semiconductor materials and things like that. So I think we're leveraging a lot of the same core technologies, but this is one space where we felt like applying it could really address an important global problem. I think the other layer to this is that materials discovery is like notoriously slow and expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So I think on average, what we've seen is it takes, around 10 years to develop a new material. And specifically for climate change, that's just not an acceptable time frame. Like we need solutions that are much faster than that. And so I think that made this a very, important and an attractive problem for us to try and tackle with the technology that we're building in this space. So I think those are sort of the main reasons. I think there are other important things that need to be addressed within climate change, though, right? Like we do need better carbon accounting technologies, especially for things like natural carbon sequestration, right? We need to have better ways of optimizing emissions associated with supply chain. We also need better adaptation technologies because the reality is like, we're not going to completely solve this problem. We're already looking at impacts of climate change today. So we need ways of understanding how different, coastal areas are going to be impacted by flooding and storms and how they can better adapt to that. So those are all things that we're doing within IBM research beyond, the materials discovery side of things.
I want to go back to a comment that you made that you said normally it could take 10 years to develop, a new material. And, I've seen this a lot with some other industries where now with the AI technologies, the ability to house a lot more data, the ability to use AI to synthesize and analyze that data more quickly, I hear that common theme. Oh my gosh, now I've been waiting for this technology. Now that I have it, I can actually get through some of these things that I've always wanted to do. Is that kind of where I'm hearing the connectivity here is we haven't been able to do this before, but now that these AI technologies and other cognitive technologies have really caught up, this is now what's allowing really the opportunity that you guys are starting to work on or have been working on.
Yeah. So I think a lot of that is definitely true. I think more and more companies with domain expert, right? So like when you look across kind of the AI landscape, right, there are sort of the players like IBM where we fundamentally have teams that have expertise in AI and we reach out to domain experts to help shape a problem and really apply AI to those problems. I think you're starting to see more companies with domain expertise who are sort of on the other side of the table start to build up their AI expertise. And I think there are places where we're meeting in the middle, right? So I think like one thing that IBM's a part of that I'm personally really excited about is this MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium. And that the objective of that consortium that MIT's created is to bring together a lot of different industry partners who have sort of those different layers of expertise. So, I mean, IBM's not the only one with AI expertise. He's part of that, but like we're one of them. And then we're also working with other companies like LafargeHolcim, who's like a huge cement supplier, right? And they have the domain expertise and they understand the problem really, really intricately. And we have the AI expertise to kind of bridge that gap. So I think that kind of is in agreement with what you were saying.
Yeah, because you started this in 2019. Or at least your shift into climate, within your research. So that was 2019. Yeah, we had the technologies there, but I know just recently, IBM has pushed out the quantum chip. So it's like suddenly, I almost feel like we're able to go faster now in 2021 than what we've been able to do in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we're starting to see more, at least on like a chemistry side of things, is that a lot more lab-based programs are embracing autonomous labs. And
Mhm.
the beauty of that is they generate an enormous amount of data. So I think one of the challenges before wasn't that there wasn't data available, but that it was like a real beast to curate it and hand it over to an AI practitioner. And oftentimes there was almost a kind of bias introduced into that, because the
Yeah.
chemist would like do all these experiments, annotate all their data in like this beautiful table, but they would really only include like the parameters that they thought were important based on
Mhm.
their experimental experience. And we know through modeling that sometimes there are things that actually end up being really important that are not intuitive to the person on the ground, right? Like you think about you have like a plant that has all these sensors, right? And the ones that you think might be the most important for predicting failure or something, they might still be really important, but there could be other things too that you wouldn't normally think of as being intuitively important for indicating that. And I think we're seeing that with chemistry now. And so by having these autonomous labs that have sensors and record a lot of more information than a chemist could do manually,
Mhm.
we're starting to be able to make better predictions to inform like what are the experiments we should go do next to make a chemist's life in the lab much more efficient, right? And use their time much better than they can if they're doing it on their own.
So if I go back to kind of where you are today and the impact that AI and other cognitive technologies have had in enabling you to forward your research more quickly, where are you seeing the greatest value? Is it on the data science side? Because you just mentioned you now have the ability to collect a lot more data, reducing the data bias, or are you seeing it in the AI development model area? I'd be curious to know your thoughts. Yeah.
I think it's both. So I think, we are taking kind of a holistic approach. So like the way that we tend to structure our thinking around this is if you think about the scientific method, and like I kind of explained this in my YouTube video too, but right, if you
We'll
think
make sure
about
everybody goes out there and watches that, by the way.
well,
Yeah.
just because I know you've seen it already, so it's kind of repetitive. But if you think about the scientific method where you're like asking a question, posing a hypothesis, creating experiments, executing those, and then like recording the results, and then as a scientist, you repeat that a lot, right? Like at least a couple of times to make sure that your results are real, and then you have to do that for every single variable that's out there, right? So it's a very slow process. And if you think about trying to do that in the realm of materials discovery, where you have like thousands of materials, thousands of different parameters, temperatures, pressures, et cetera, and then different processes, it becomes like a very challenging problem. And so I think that's where AI modeling brings value, because all of those different conditions are much more manageable when you're thinking about it from like a modeling perspective versus having to go test each one by one in an experimental lab. And so I think, but if we take a step back and look at that scientific method, like we kind of have solutions that we're trying to apply to each of those steps to make it faster. So there is the autonomous lab that kind of sits at the end of the experimental side of the scientific method, where we have to actually start testing things in the real world and making sure that they work the way we say they do, in a in silico scenario. But if you go back to the beginning and you think about creating a question and a hypothesis, right? As a scientist, especially if you're new to a field, it takes a really long time to kind of get your arms around like what's already been done, what's kind of widely accepted, what's like thought of as, it's been published once, but nobody really believes it. But it's still out there. And like, if you're new to the field, you don't have that background information, right? And so, you can go read a review article, but all of these nuances kind of get missed because there's sort of like a political correctness about all of that, right? And then on top of that, if you are an expert in the field, oftentimes being a deep expert can be a hindrance in and of itself, because you're so fundamentally grounded in like what's been done and what works in your field that you may not necessarily consider what's been done in another field and how that could apply to what you're doing, right? I think it becomes very easy to dismiss things as like, oh, that won't work for this reason. And so what we're trying to build are a series of tools. It's called Knowledge Hub for Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage. And so what we're doing is we're taking journal articles from the CCUS space, but eventually we'll start to expand beyond the CCUS space. And then we're we can annotate these manually. Eventually, we're working towards annotating them in an automated fashion. But right now we have domain experts that go in and annotate like different terms, right? So if it's a material or a variable or like a temperature or property or whatever, and then the relationships between them. And you do that for many, many articles. And we then have tools that IBM's built for this, but we take those annotated documents and we create a knowledge graph. And so this is like a visual representation of all the information that's in your hub of materials. And it allows you to see things like how often a material has popped up, how it relates to other materials, how it relates to certain properties. And so you can visually explore that. And that's like a really useful tool for kind of making these types of connections that are difficult to make by just reading papers one by one. Mm-hmm. And it allows you to start to see where there might be gaps in the literature, right? Oh, this material was studied once, but nobody really looked at it for this application. That might be interesting. Or this material sits outside of CCUS. Somebody's used it once, you know, for as a membrane in the automotive industry or something, but it has similar properties to things that we've seen for CCUS. That might be interesting to study, right? So those are the sorts of things where we're starting to create more informed hypotheses that would be difficult to do by just like manually reading the literature for a new person or somebody who's been in the field for a while. So I think, you know, and that requires a lot of also NLP technologies to enable things like querying and, you know, and entity recognition and things like that. So, so I think that's kind of like one area that we're building things in that I think requires data, but not necessarily data science in the way that we think of it normally today. Mm-hmm. Once we have those questions to go after, then we have, we kind of start getting into like the nitty gritty molecular modeling, right? And so we use a lot of machine learning and generative models to do things like predict chemical properties of existing materials that maybe haven't been studied for CCUS. So rather than having to go do that manually with a lot of experimentation, we can take a list of known chemicals and predict, you know, their carbon capture binding capacity or other properties that are related to that, and then rank them based on performance. And so that helps us really guide what experiments we might go do downstream, how many materials we want to look at. This is also useful when you're starting to mix things together. So solvent blends are like a really popular topic right now. Looking at the individual properties and how mixing them together leads to new properties is something that machine learning is really amenable to. And that's something we're working on as well. And then, you know, we're doing this we're also like predicting chemical properties and performance of nanoporous materials and membranes. And we can simulate their performance under different conditions and things like that. So that modeling side is super, super important to what we're doing. And that's a pretty substantial core part of our research program. And then like all of that then eventually translates into experimental work. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah, no. So I have a hypothetical theory, and you just tell me if this is like working. So somebody's out there did some research on materials for oyster shells, which he was out there looking at it for oyster shells as regard to maybe perhaps a new plastics. But when it was posted in the journal, you noticed that through your AI, you know, sifting through this information, that it looked like it may have some impact in absorbing CO2, but you're not sure. But it'd be interesting to really test that theory out. So by using the breakdown of the components of the powder of say the oyster shells, and combining that with some of the solvents and some of the other chemicals that you have in your knowledge base, you could do those simulations very quickly to even assess whether or not this is something that we should even look at in more detail.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
Exactly.
All right. I followed along. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think like something like that, right? Like you might look at it. So, I mean, like I'm just guessing here, but like probably it would be something more akin to like a solid sorbent material.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we would put that, we have like simulations for how that would perform under different pressures and temperatures. And you could start to predict like the kinetics, like for maybe different concentrations of CO2 or different. So you get like all those like binding isotherms. And, you know, based on that, you could say like, this might be interesting to look at under these conditions, or this is like absolutely awful. We shouldn't look at this. Right. But it becomes kind of a screening and predictive tool. Right.
I think what you've helped really articulate is I walked into this discussion thinking AI was going to have a direct impact on what you're doing with trying to figure out climate change, or, the materials discovery for climate change, but you've also helped really highlight that, oh, well, it's not just that. We use AI in so many other, what I'm not sure if I should call it back office or administrative, but all these things that would take somebody months to sift through, information, or, months and maybe potentially years to go through all these little variables and combinations of this chemical and this solvent connected with this to even see if it was an opportunity that we should even focus on. And I think that's the piece that I think's been very enlightening for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the message I would give is that, like, the overarching theme of what we're trying to do, we refer to as accelerated discovery. And I think that's something that can be applied certainly not just to carbon capture materials, but not even just to materials, right? Like, there are all sorts of scientific questions out there that benefit from accelerating the scientific method, right? So that's kind of, I think, the message that I would make.
Yeah. So I'm gonna spin us back on the climate, on the direct research that you're doing. So if I get this right, it's materials discovery, and that material, because the reason I asked this question is I read an article prior to 2019 where some of the companies that you've mentioned, the power plants, the cement plants, the steel plants, they have the plumes, which is, those smokestacks, that's where the I don't know what it's called, but the really bad stuff is coming out. And a couple years ago, I read an article that said that there was these devices that they could attach on top of that smokestack, that as the CO2 is coming out, it would reduce it by, 1 or 2%, because there was something sitting on top of the smokestack that would pull the CO2 out. So coming back to you, when you say you're working on materials discovery, is that a physical application of when you discover a material, that's where it would go?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's an example of point source capture. And so, yeah, so there, I mean, like, gas separation, which is just like a fancy way of saying, like, taking the bad stuff out of power plant emissions, right, has been around for a long time, right? Like in the 80s, there was a huge push to reduce, like, acid rain and things like that, and all these like sulfates and things that were coming out of chemical and power plant facilities. And so it's not like we don't know how to do this. There hasn't been a huge focus on doing it for CO2 until recently. And I mean, I shouldn't say recently, this has been around for decades, but certainly it's ramped up a lot.
Right. So if I say prior to all of this, prior to the focus, what do you think the percentage that we were impacting before, let's say 2015, compared to where you think we are now, if you have a perspective? Like, have we gotten any better?
Like, how much carbon were we capturing before versus how much we're capturing now?
Yeah.
I mean, it's small. It's still less than 1%. So whatever that change was really, insignificant. So I think the challenge we face now is that most of the applications of this have been at, like, a large scale pilot level. There are most of the larger examples are in Europe. I think the other challenge, right, is, like, once you, and this, we have research on this too, but, like, once you capture the carbon dioxide, what do you do with it, right? That was gonna be my next question.
Yeah. So, thank you. What do we do with it? Feed it to the plants. I don't know.
Yeah. So there's so much of it, right? That realistically, like, most of it will probably be stored underground in geological storage sites. And this is also not really new technology. So for a long time, oil and gas companies would, they didn't even necessarily use captured CO2, but there's a technology called enhanced oil recovery, where basically if you inject supercritical CO2 into spent oil wells, it allows you to extract additional oil or natural gas out of these wells. And there's a whole bunch of different criticisms for this. And, there's very good reasons why people don't like it, because it, doesn't sound great to say we're, like, squeezing more fossil fuel out of the earth, right?
Or storing it underground. What? Yeah.
Right. Well, so
I mean, should we find a way? I mean, totally off topic here, but should we find a way to be able to either completely chemically dissipate? That's not the right word, but to completely I can't think of the right word. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what you're trying to ask, right, is like, are there ways that we can actually like utilize it in other more useful ways than just like storing it underground, right?
That or somehow where it's, evaporated or it's completely dissolved. I think dissolved was probably the word I was looking at. Completely dissolved or
Yeah.
something. Yeah, because I mean, totally off topic, but we'll save that for another interview.
Well, I think I can kind of answer your question a little bit. So the reality is that the market for utilizing CO2 is just never going to be large enough
mhm.
to offset the amount of CO2 that we have to capture. Like it's just not realistic. Um, but storage underground is like totally reasonable, and we know how to do
Okay.
this, and there are a lot of good examples of this working. So there's like there's a Carbfix plant in Iceland where they're injecting CO2 underground with really good success.
Does it stay underground? Like
It does. So there's some concern. I would say like there's I mean, in my opinion, I would say there's maybe like slightly overblown concern that it will leak out again. So just to go back to the enhanced oil recovery for a second, I think the benefit of EOR is that it reduces the amount of energy that would be required to like go drill another well if you're going to extract it anyway.
Right.
But the other, but that's neither here nor there. But I think like the good thing about EOR is it's given us a lot of decades of experience of how to do this well. So we have good ways of monitoring geological storage sites for a long time. We've shown, so generally the way that like a reservoir is structured is you have like either saline aquifers or these spent oil and gas reservoirs, and there's a cap rock on top of them, which kind of sits underground, but like more or less sequesters that. If that cap rock is intact, it's very stable and the CO2 really doesn't come back out. There's a question of how stable it is if you've drilled a bunch of holes into it because of enhanced oil recovery. So that's I think a valid concern, but it is fairly stable. But there's a lot of interest in what we call secondary storage mechanisms. And so that's when the CO2 either dissolves into the brine underground where it becomes more stable, or it gets trapped in these capillary structures underground and it's more stable there. Or best of all, it converts back into solid carbonate rock where it stays.
There you
forever.
go. That would be wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So again, I'm such a poor host because I'm the one who took us off topic.
No, but it's okay.
But this was such an interesting subject.
But there is material component to that because the process of mineralization is quite slow. And so I think there's a lot of focus now on how we can accelerate that process by either changing the injection conditions or adding other chemicals to it to accelerate that process. And that's something that we actually are working on at IBM as well. So.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. We're both passionate about this topic. So you mentioned at the very beginning of this that we are 1.5 to I think we're now at 1.5 degrees per the recent summit that I heard.
Yeah, we're not there yet, but we're on track.
Right.
Yeah.
Utilizing this technology or this materials discovery that you're working on, how close are we really to impacting this? And more specifically, you also mentioned that maybe right now on top of those smokestacks, we're probably like maybe less than 1%. Where do we need to be in order to really make an impact?
Yeah. So what we're trying to build, right? Like IBM's not going to create the next great carbon capture material ourselves. Like we're not a materials company. That's not what we do. We have a history in it, but it's not what we do today. But what we're trying to do is enable those companies that are good at this, right? The materials development companies, the engineering firms that build these sites to go and do this much better and faster than they can today. I think if we can get to a point where we can bring the cost of carbon capture down to a couple dollars per ton of CO2, then the ability to scale up adoption of these technologies grows dramatically. And that's important because ultimately we need to get to a point where we're really, I mean, we have to get to a point where we're essentially emitting no fossil fuels into the atmosphere. So like in a perfect world, we would capture everything we're emitting today. We need to get as close to that as we can. I think the other part to this, which is like not the fun technology part, but is equally important, is that we need a way to enforce major emitters to capture their emissions. And we
Mhm.
need to make a way, and that's not always feasible for certain technologies. So, right, like if you look at American Airlines, they're looking at buying engineered carbon offsets to offset their emissions from their airliners, right, from their jets, which is just really difficult to abate through technology directly. And the same can be said for other types of like transportation, and some agricultural processes are just difficult to abate because they're so distributed, or there just aren't good like fuel alternatives, things like that. So those engineered carbon credits are also like a valuable way to come to a net zero carbon emissions world. But that has to be enforced, right? Like I think realistically, it's not going to be done out of the goodness of every company's heart. I mean, some are much better at this than others, but we have to get to a point where the largest emitters are being held accountable for what they're emitting, and they're either heavily incented or they're to do it, or they're penalized for not doing it. And that has to come from government and international organizations.
Right. What's the total cost now? Because you mentioned we have to get it down, but where are we at? Like,
so the estimates are like around a couple $100 per ton of CO2.
That's a huge gap.
I heard the other day, and I like, you'll have to fact check me on this, but that oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the company, but there's direct air capture units that are in Iceland. It's not Carbon Engineering, it's the other one. I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but it I think people are paying upwards of $1,000 to $2,000 per ton of CO2 for direct air capture units, like carbon credits essentially that are engineered, which is incredible to me. But I don't think that that's something that is like super scalable, right? Yeah. I think we have to get to a lower value than that.
Okay.
So it's kind of meeting in the middle, right? Like it's like bringing the cost down, but then also incentivizing people to do it. And if we can treat CO2 like a waste product, like we do for other waste products, then people will start having to do it, right? And that will drive adoption of these technologies. And I actually think that as people or as companies are forced to adopt these technologies, that will actually accelerate the discovery process even more, because they're going to want to bring those costs down for themselves to avoid those penalties. So.
Well, Stacey, we have come to an end of our discussion. I thank you so much for your time. I know that there are people listening who have backgrounds in material science, who have backgrounds in life sciences and medicine and biology and physiology and all the things that we've talked about today. As we leave our podcast, what would be some lessons learned? What if somebody says, I had a medical background, but I'm much more interested in the future of climate now that we've heard, Stacey talk. What do I need to do to change my path?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about climate change is that it really touches everything, right? So you don't necessarily have to go and be like the next great renewable technology entrepreneur to help solve climate change, right? There are going to be health impacts from climate change. So if you're a doctor, there are things you can probably do today within your own research to understand how different marginalized groups are going to be impacted differentially, how you can help, in some of these projected changes with there's going to be changes with vector-borne disease, due to changing climate and things like that. So I think like for every field that's out there, whether it's like the social sciences or life sciences or the tech industry or material science or what have you, all of these things will be touched in some way or another by climate change. And so you don't necessarily have to change your field to have a difference in that. But I think also the other message I would give to people who are interested in, kind of adapting to new fields is that don't underplay the skills that you've built by going through the process of learning something. So, I think if nothing else, I've convinced myself over the past couple of years that I can go learn a new domain if I have to. Like I am perfectly capable of doing that. And my core skills in having like a technical mindset, right? Like I'm not an expert in every material science experiment that's out there, but I've done enough experimentation in my life to understand like what it takes to have a good experiment. Right. And so those sorts of translatable skills. I think almost every researcher I've ever met is always like, but I'm so specific. How do I apply myself to this other space? And I think we all kind of like get a little bit of imposter syndrome, you know, as we kind of move into these new fields. And I think it's good to not overstate what you know, but I wouldn't undermine, you know, what you do know. There's plenty of translatable skills out there, you know, across different disciplines.
I think that's very valuable feedback. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us on our podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.